I have a hypothesis, and it's been plugging around in my brain for a really long time, and I've really wanted to tell all of you about it, but I've been a little bit worried because I don't have the chops necessarily to back it up. At least I didn't, but I've been touting the notion of social science, so why not do active research about my hypothesis? Okay, I've been hamming up, yeah, but this is not a joke. I actually do have in the Discord a brand new research channel. It's a forum-based Discord where we can submit hypotheses and actually move forward with the social science of online community. And I figure I am not in academia, but like I can do active research, right? Like it doesn't need to be super rigorous, but it can at least give us the information that we need and we can do it together, right? Like peer review, it's a thing. I'm not sure if you could tell, but I'm super excited about this. And like half of my friends looked at me and went like, of course this is your next step. Why wouldn't it be your next step? But I digress. The hypothesis that has been going around in my brain is called the 6 burdens of online community growth. And I did an entire CMX masterclass about exactly this topic. And it makes me very, very excited to be able to say, hey, I've observed these things in the world and I think that they're a thing, but why don't we actually move forward and test and prove it? I have a survey. It's called a qualification survey, which is all about asking who you are as a community. I am looking for specific online communities for me to interview in a semi-structured manner to better understand what questions I should ask when going into large-scale research on this specific topic. So let's talk about it. What are the burdens of community growth? The 6 burdens of community growth were just something that I noticed over the course of my career as I move forward into community. What I had noticed was that large communities and small communities had to develop their cultures completely differently. But as smaller communities grew into larger communities, this frame switch, this infrastructural change, combated directly in a dialectical tension with the culture that they needed to be. In other words, there was this tension between the tradition of who we are as a culture and who we need to be if we plan to grow. This is tradition versus innovation. Because of these primary conflicts, there ended up being a chasm in the growth factor, and a lot of communities didn't necessarily make it. Some didn't even want to. Some wanted to stay small. And indeed, a lot of them actually function better while small. And that's what these 6 main burdens are. They are what I hypothesize, are several cultural universals, underlying cultural facets that create problems crossing that rift. All right, so what are the 6 burdens? The 6 burdens are in no particular order aside from alphabetical. The burden of allocation, attribution, contribution, distribution, remuneration, and stratification. Fancy. Every time I say the word remuneration, it just makes me feel like so hoity-toity academic Harvard style. The burden of allocation is a transition that occurs from small communities into large communities, where smaller communities feel a greater need to perform actions, a greater need for responsibility. After all, there's not a lot of you, so of course someone's going to take on a responsibility that could take weeks or months, perhaps years to accomplish. Creating a website or creating an entire app, doing an entire open source project, or doing the social media for a nonprofit that you love in the local area. And as that community gets bigger and the amount of people start to grow, the amalgam of individuals start to move away from this notion of, quote, responsibility and more toward one of allocation. I would love to know what I can do for this community, but I don't want to spend 6 hours performing an individual task. What is one project that you might be willing to provide to me? People are moving from this notion of responsibility. I can perform a regular, larger task, and I can see the long-term reward and satisfaction of performing that task, into one of allocation. I can do one small part for my larger community, and I can do it with other people that I love, appreciate, and adore. Moving to the next one, let's talk about the burden of attribution. This is the notion that meetings and gatherings and content produced from those gatherings, the contributions that you give into an online community tend to be very specific when the community is small. But as it scales, that becomes more vague. Meetings become less important for people to attend. Information becomes less easy for people to understand. There's this shared sense of understanding that starts to deplete as you start to get more and more people. And as a result, what we've had to do is use something like low to high media context theory. The notion that meetings aren't enough. We need an asynchronous mode of information to disperse information. One particular example is a newsletter. When you get large enough that that newsletter becomes the only way for people to interact, maybe you need a forum or a YouTube channel, or you need a blog in order to make short-term discussion into long-term assets. What that's covering is simply this notion of shared understanding or shared concept for being part of a whole. And because that attribution isn't necessarily there, people's contributions don't feel as important unless they find themselves in the more concrete, high context documents. The third one, contribution, is actually the one that I started with. This was the first one that I initially identified. And all this says is as people get more and more involved in the community, the amount of work that they are expected to perform increases. But at a certain period of time, you get a finite amount of people doing that work, and the amount of work that you have starts to slow down. In other words, it's a logarithmic scale. So it starts out really fast at the beginning, and then it starts to slow down. And that would be fine and dandy, but the problem is the reward factor. As people continue to do that work, your community continues to get more prosperous. The reward of the few people's amount of work impacts the larger community as a whole, and reward becomes exponential. Everyone is benefiting from the few people's interactions. Ordinarily, this would be okay, but it's up to community managers and it's up to the infrastructure that we produce to really fix that problem, to make it more even. The fourth one happens to do with distribution, and this is the one that a lot of community managers find endlessly frustrating, because this is the one where all of our communication paths and our strategies and all of our things start to gradually and systemically break down. At the core of the burden of distribution is the communication channels, strategies, and standard operating procedures that we, as core stakeholders of our community, tend to put forward. This community is placed on a Discord forum, or it's placed on a discourse, or it's placed on a standard website. And we build structured communication paths that act as social glue for us to stay together. People's relationships and peer-to-peer connections, being able to clash and talk with one another, they don't stay on those platforms. When our community starts to grow, it starts to move beyond the structures that we continue to build. And it's almost like cat and mouse. We have to chase the growing community that gets so large that the grapevine or unstructured communication becomes too difficult for community managers to manage. So we need community intelligence platforms to bring in yet another platform, to connect yet another platform. It encourages us as community builders to constantly add and change, subtract, and build tools. The fifth one is money, money, money. The fifth one is remuneration. And unfortunately, it's not as positive as it sounds. You see, the fifth one has to do with your key stakeholders and the people who are actually paying to keep your community up and afloat. This is primarily felt by brand communities, and it's going to be what underlies the whole notion of community value, always equating to dollars and dimes and ROI for the stakeholder. The reality is communities on the internet cost money. And by and large, even in open source and volunteer communities, there's a certain amount of value that, if not equated, will inevitably lead to burnout, especially where the burden of contribution is concerned. What's important for remuneration, however, is as your community begins to grow, abstraction layers begin to occur in the community. i.e., In order to determine the value or the ROI of a community, you need more people. You need more contribution. You need to measure more. That means more layers, more people coming in and acting all of that action, and more people and more people. And before you know it, the people who are paying for the community are several layers away from the community. It's a game of telephone. Tell us how valuable your community is. I don't have time to go into the community and get that sense of belonging for itself. So as it grows, the notion from primary stakeholders that their value is being reprised becomes longer and longer and longer, less and less and less easy for them to determine at the beginning. And what that means is you need better metric systems. You need better ways of measuring for individuals who are several layers removed from your actual community, but who are responsible for paying for it, to really understand and get the value. You have to make the value of your community shown in the metrics that you provide. And that's the case for open source communities, it's the case for nonprofit communities, it's the case for brand communities. But especially in brand communities, it has become such a big problem that it's almost all we talked about in the community space between 2021 and 2022. Can you measure that ROI? Okay, I'll calm down a little bit because the next one, this is where DEI comes in. And the big problem here is called stratification. For those of you who have already made the connection and know where this is going, stratification is unavoidable. There's no stopping it, especially as you continue to grow. There's a lot of sociological reasons for this. There's a lot of anthropological reasons for this, but it is unavoidable, and therefore it is indeed a cultural universal. And I would actually love it if you filled out the survey, because that's honestly the only way I'm gonna know if it actually looks different from a large majority of physical world anthropology research. So stratification is exactly what it sounds like. This is your community getting so big that it starts to break down into layers. Just like we saw with the remuneration issue, as people start to move away, we start to build barriers and we start to create in-groups and out-groups. Some people are VIPs, some people are veterans, some people are still newcomers. And as we stratify our communities, they become easier for us to understand and respond to. They become easier for us to architect and structure. And in fact, this stratification is the very nature of community infrastructure. But at the same time, it can cause some problems, namely problems of power distance and problems of spiral of silence. I'm going to do a video and it's going to pop up specifically right here about power distance and spiral of silence, but suffice to say, I have covered it several times on this channel, and it is very, very critical that you understand exactly what power distance and spiral of silence are. It is like step one, numero uno, important skill for any community builder to understand. That is the 6 burdens. And if you're nodding your head and going, why is this a hypothesis? Well, the reason it's a hypothesis is because it's coming out of my head, right? I came up with the burdens of community growth out of 10 years of experience. But I also know that that doesn't necessarily cut muster when it comes to social science. There's a difference between me standing up here as an influencer and as a leader in the space, and then there's doing the actual social science. And that's what I want to do. So right here, this survey is a qualification survey for us to kickstart the process of performing actual real social science here in the socially constructed community Discord. And every single step of the way, I'm going to come right back here to the YouTube channel in order to update you on where we are. I've already got several people lined up for those interviews. I'm hoping for 30 in the next month. So I would really love it if you could share the survey as well and subscribe here on YouTube so that you can get more information on the 6 burdens as we move forward. This will keep you updated, so do it and share it. And I'm looking very, very forward to doing this process with you. And if you want to know more about the burdens of community, I did an entire CMX masterclass right here. So you should click that next. You should do the survey, and then you should click that. And you should do the survey, but click that too. But survey and then click that. I'm a marketing expert, and I know better than to give you multiple call to actions.